Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Saskatchewan-born Cree Métis filmmaker Danis Goulet. Goulet recently released her feature film directorial debut, Night Raiders. The Indigenous sci-fi thriller stars Elamaya Tailfeathers. It was released in Canadian theaters in October and holds the record for the largest budget and the widest release for an Indigenous film in the country. Danis, thanks so much for being with us.
You're welcome.
And congrats on Night Raiders. I had a chance to watch it yesterday, but I feel like we've had guests on the show who've been talking about it for a couple of years now. Can you start by giving us a little rundown on what Night Raiders is about?
Yeah, Night Raiders is set in the year 2043, and it imagines that children are property of the state in a post-Civil War North America. And the story focuses on Niska, a Cree mother, and her daughter who are on the run because they obviously don't want her child Wasis to be taken away from her.
You're also the writer of the film. Where did you draw your inspirations for it from?
Well, I'm Cree Métis, originally from La Ronge, Saskatchewan, and I've always told stories about home and about our people. And when it came to making my first feature, I had just done my first foray into the genre space. I made a sci-fi short called Wakening, and you know, I was thinking a lot about the impact that so many colonial policies have had on our people, and especially the residential school system, because obviously it's had a huge impact. And so I wanted to talk about that impact, but I wanted to do it in a way that I felt would be a fresh way into it, which is to do it as a genre movie.
There are, like you say, obvious connections to the residential school system. The children in the movie are taken away, sent off to the academy for indoctrination, amongst other things. Why did you want to draw those comparisons?
Well, I started developing the movie back in 2013, and I felt at the time that it hadn't been a national conversation enough, and there wasn't enough visibility on the issue. And obviously, since that time, many things have happened. The TRC released their findings in 2015 as I continued to write it. And then, of course, we all know what's been in the news this past summer with the uncovering of graves. But I just felt as though, obviously, the education system in Canada had failed at revealing the truth of what happened at residential school, and that, you know, obviously, this has had a profound impact on all aspects of Indigenous life. So it was important to tell a story about this so that people might understand what it is to be in a system where your children are taken away from you by law, as we know. And we also know the system was in place for 7 generations of Indigenous families. But I just wanted to bring more visibility to this and to the impact it had on our families and communities, and also to celebrate in a way our strength in spite of everything that's happened. So, you know, around the time that I started making the film, or at least developing it, the Idle No More protest movement was happening, and I thought it was really inspirational the way that youth were standing up to be seen and heard. And I also wanted to tell a story about our power and our resistance and our resilience as Indigenous people.
I've read your time in Standing Rock during the No DAPL protests also was a source of inspiration for you with this film. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I went down to Standing Rock to do some research, and what's so beautiful about when you first drive down into the valley, you know, where there might be a regular valley, there was, you know, pretty much a whole town. It was like going to a powwow, but like times 10, like the biggest powwow you've ever been at. And it was just this beautiful community. And as you drive in, you drive down a row of, you know, 200 flags of all of the nations that were there in solidarity. And I really wanted to express that solidarity that exists between nations, whether it's within Canada or globally, because it's such a beautiful, unity of nations that all understand what they've been through under colonization. And in the story, there's even like a global extension of this with a Maori character, because I wanted to express that in some way. But certainly the images and the feeling of being at Standing Rock was some of the things that I wanted to try to capture in the film. The surveillance that people are under at all times. There's a helicopter buzzing over your head at all times. There's snipers on every hill. There's tanks going around everywhere. And the presence of the military and the threat of violence is something that I will never forget after coming back from there.
Yeah, I won't give it away, but there's parts near the end of the film that certainly reminded me of our time in Standing Rock as well. You mentioned you've been writing this since 2013. When we had Jeff Barnaby on the show, he spoke, about it taking more than a decade to get Blood Quantum on the screen. Was this a pretty lengthy process for yourself as well to bring Night Raiders to the screen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the writing took quite a long time, and then, you go through funding, and we actually turned this into the first ever international Indigenous co-production between Canada and New Zealand, which was a really exciting thing, but took some time. So yeah, it's not uncommon in Canada for it to just take that long. But also, Indigenous filmmakers have faced a lot of barriers in our industry over many years. And it's an exciting time because we're starting to see a new wave of Indigenous filmmakers that are coming to the forefront. And that wave has been a long time coming, but it's also based on decades of advocacy that has happened in our screen industry in order to see films like mine and Jeff's actually get made at a larger scale.
You mentioned, it took a while to write and everything else, but were there other challenges that you faced in getting the film made?
Sure. It's a huge production to mount. It takes hundreds of people, for many years in a way, getting us to a certain moment. But there's also barriers that we face, like, misconceptions about the stories that we're trying to tell. I mean, in a year that we went to a broadcaster for financing, they gave us notes back that they didn't feel like the residential school allegory was relevant because we as a country had moved on from that. And to me, the fact that a gatekeeper was giving a note like that in the very month that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was releasing their findings was, a testimony to what Indigenous filmmakers face when they go to get their projects financed that might be different than what a regular project might be up against.
Well, congrats on persevering, and I hope you hung on to that note that you received. Danis, much more to talk about. We're just going to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with writer-director Danis Goulet. Stick around.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is filmmaker Danis Goulet, whose first feature-length film, Night Raiders, hit theaters in October. And Danis, while arriving in theaters, Night Raiders has broken the glass ceiling on a couple of milestones for Indigenous film, one of them being the biggest theatrical release for an Indigenous film. Is that a pretty big deal?
Yeah, it felt like a pretty big deal. When I saw the list of theaters that our distributor Elevation sent us the week before we went in, I actually got kind of emotional because it had been such a long journey getting the film made with so many battles to fight, and to know that we were there and we were going out in 80 theaters across the country, including in places that I'd grown up in Saskatchewan. It really was a big deal and meant a lot.
Also a big deal is that Night Raiders has the biggest budget for an Indigenous-led film in Canada. What do you think that means, not only for you, but for the industry?
Well, I think it's a testament to a moment that we're arriving at. Prior to my film being made, Jeff Barnaby's Blood Quantum had been the biggest budget Indigenous feature. So prior to that, our films were not being made at a certain scale. So the fact that two have now arrived here, and when the films do well, it sends a larger message to the industry to say, continue giving these opportunities and resources to Indigenous filmmakers, because, you know, the results speak for themselves. And, you know, we've always known we could get here. So, yeah, it's really exciting to have these outcomes.
One last first that we can mention here that you touched on earlier, and that's that Night Raiders is a Canada-New Zealand co-production and Indigenous first for the Canadian film industry. Can you talk about why that's significant?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of us in the industry that have been dreaming about this kind of international collaboration. And so to finally see it come together at Night Raiders was really exciting. International co-production is a bit more complicated than financing a single country film. And so we had teams that had to work together, including an incredibly powerhouse Maori producer, Ainsley Gardner, who celebrated in her home country of New Zealand. And so to come together in this formal way, to me, was a celebration of these global connections that Indigenous people have. And so to do that in the film and then also see it reflected on screen as a part of the story was just really exciting.
I guess the caveat on these accomplishments, though, is that, you know, the biggest budget for an Indigenous-led film. Are we at a place where an Indigenous-led film can just have the biggest budget in Canadian history attached to it, period?
I don't think we're there yet to have the biggest budget Canadian film. I think that but, you know, we're getting there, and we're getting to a point where we're proving that anything's possible. And like I said, there's a new exciting wave that's coming, and I'm so excited for this era in storytelling, because I think, you know, as the great Alanisa Bomsawin has been saying, when I caught up with her a couple months ago, you know, we're going somewhere that we've never been before.
As somebody who's been around the industry for a while with Imaginative and doing short films and with TIFF, what changes have you seen in recent years?
Yes, so much. I mean, we've seen the creation of the Indigenous Screen Office 3 years ago, which was, you know, again, based on decades of advocacy. We saw the creation of a targeted film stream for Indigenous feature film production at Telefilm. And all of those were based on pointed advocacy to create these new agencies to support our industry. Because for years we had seen the Arts Council supporting filmmakers in the short film arena, but we weren't seeing that translate into feature film production, and especially dramatic feature film production. So I think giving these things a push and saying that this needs to happen. And then thankfully and wonderfully, the funding agencies responded really well. And, you know, the Canada Media Fund played a huge role in the creation of the Indigenous Screen Office. So it's great to see that we're in a moment where people are getting on board with, you know, what we've been saying has been true for a really long time. And yeah, it's part of what's getting us here. Back when in the Imaginative days in the mid-2000s, you know, we would be saying support Indigenous people in key creative roles as directors, writers, and producers. And we'd be in rooms that would be met with silence or just confusion about why that was important. And so it's really great now that the conversation has moved so much that we no longer have to keep saying why it's important. That message seems to be getting through. So it's just a matter now of keeping going and keeping the pressure on, and also just seeing larger scale and diversity of genre for what Indigenous filmmakers are able to do.
And I'm going to talk about that diversity in genre in a bit, but you know, you're talking about the funding, and obviously that's a huge component to all of this. How much of a say does the audience have, you know, in their reaction watching these films to get those funding bodies to the table?
Oh, the audience is absolutely key. So first off, in order for, you know, Indigenous stories to be embraced, people do have to come and watch them. So the first thing I'd say is support Indigenous storytelling. You know, we've wanted this for so long. And I think, you know, when I first got involved with Imaginative, what was so life-changing about that for me was seeing what it meant after 100 years of cinema misrepresentation, where Hollywood has been out there perpetuating all kinds of, you know, harmful depictions of us on screen for so long. You know, the power of us being at the helm of our own stories is incredible. And you would see it in the theater at Imaginative in those early days, what it meant to communities when they could see themselves and their authentic experiences on screen. And I know that for myself as an audience member, I felt like my heart was leaping out of my chest in recognition. It was such an exciting time, and it laid a pathway forward to say, this is what's possible. And so we need audiences to embrace the work, and so seek out Indigenous made work. And, it's only going to make everything better for all of us and for storytelling.
It's been quite something to watch for the last few years, for sure. We've had a lot of people in front of the camera and behind the camera doing huge projects that are getting a lot of recognition. What do you see as the challenges for Indigenous storytellers still in film and the television industry?
Well, I was a part of a report a few years ago that looked at barriers in the industry for Indigenous filmmakers, and they are up against, a lack of understanding about sometimes the importance of the story, sometimes the perspective, sometimes it's racist ideas, sometimes it's just ignorance. But, people still get a lot of mixed messages in the industry about what they should and should not be making. And, it's taken a long time for us to be able to make our case and say, yes, our stories are worthwhile, but not only that, they will have an audience and they can go out in theaters. They can be made at a certain scale. But it's taken a while, I think, for the industry to really be listening to that call. And so filmmakers all across the industry still face a lot of barriers. I think there are also trust issues because a lot of Indigenous filmmakers are in this for a purpose. It's not just putting a product out to the market. We're storytellers, and we hold our stories in a very serious way. We know there are protocols in place that we have to follow. We know that our stories don't just belong to us, that they belong to our communities as well. And so there are a lot of ethics involved in Indigenous storytelling. And so that's a really important piece of it as well.
And Danis, we're going to get into that in a little bit. We just have to step aside for another quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with filmmaker Danis Goulet. Stay with us. Welcome back. Our guest this week is Cree Métis filmmaker Danis Goulet. And Danis, there's some themes that show themselves when you look at some of your short films as well. Awakening also has that post-apocalyptic near future storyline. They also have, like you say, allegories and commentary, which I love. What has drawn you to the sci-fi genre?
Yeah, I grew up watching sci-fi. In my hometown of La Ronge, there was actually a theater that was still running called the Aurora Theater, which was right on the lake. And I saw all of the early, films that were out in the world at that point. Like I remember seeing E.T. and then talking about it at school the next day, seeing Return of the Jedi and Tron. And so I grew up on sci-fi films. And then when I came out to Toronto to start to pursue film, I kind of got into film festivals, which very much sort of distributes more independent film. And then I also got involved with the Toronto International Film Festival as a programmer. And that is, you have access in that realm to world cinema from all over the place. But again, independent film. And so I started making I would characterize them as more indie films. And then coming back into genre actually happened by accident. It was just that I was given this opportunity to make a short. And I thought, I wanted to try doing something about Wisagichak and Witago, because those are our two most classic Cree characters from the oral stories. And I thought, I've seen them on film, I've seen them in storybooks, and I've seen them in animation, but I'd never seen them in sort of like a live action way. And as soon as I thought about bringing them to the screen, I didn't want to give them like a quaint folkloric type of feel. I wanted them to have gravity because, these beings had power and they meant so much. And they were, they were the beings that the stories got told about all across the territory of where I was from. And so all of a sudden I felt like, well, in order to make this film, it sort of has to be a fantasy film. And then I realized that instead of setting it in the past, I thought it would be really dynamic to imagine those characters in the future, because, you know, there's something really timeless about them. And it was a way of also declaring that they have always been here, that they're here now, and that they'll always be here in the future, that there's that timelessness. So then I decided to set them in a dystopian future where they had to meet up in a dilapidated theater. And yeah, that was just a really fun experience for me. And going into genre opened up really exciting creative possibilities. And from there, that's sort of where I decided to make Night Raiders as a genre film as well.
In addition to including some of those traditional oral stories, you also include the Cree language, not only in Night Raiders, but in your other short films as well. Has there been any pushback to you on any of that?
Yeah, one time I got asked to take the Cree out of one of my films because it would be more accessible for audiences. And so I had to speak to, again, a gatekeeper and make the case for why it was so important for me as a Cree person to put my language on screen, and also why it was important creatively for the film. And those conversations can be really difficult. You know, as we know, our languages are something that we're losing. My dad speaks Cree as a first language. I am not a fluent Cree speaker. I work with him in the development of all of my projects to integrate Cree in some way, and not just in terms of translation, even in terms of conceptual thought and philosophy. So I talk to him about philosophical concepts, and then I weave that into the development of the film, and then always incorporate some point of some kind of the language, because it's so important. And, you know, what people are doing in the realm of language revitalization is so crucial. But if there's a way that I can put Cree on screen, as we know in our languages, there's entire universes and worldviews contained within them. And so there's a beauty and a poetry and a recognition when you see them on screen. It makes the film really unique and special, and part of what is worth celebrating about it.
Well, lots to celebrate for sure. Danis, we're down to our last minute here, but maybe you can tell us a bit about the movie that you've been working on for Netflix, a thriller called Ivy.
Yeah, I'm working on a new thriller that I shot this summer, and it's about a smart house that turns on the family. So it's been a really fun project, and it's starring the Brazilian-American actor Alice Braga, who people might know from Queen of the South, but she's an absolute star, and it's been amazing to work with her on the film. And I think it's going to be coming out sometime next year.
Well, looking forward to it. And again, Danis, appreciate you taking some time here for us, and wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you so much, Kinanes Komtin.
That is all the time we have for this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. That's where you'll find a link to all the podcasts as well. That's all the time we do have for this week. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll see you back here next week.